Hello and welcome to the video. This is a quick video for those people who get in touch and ask me, what radio should I get? Because you'll see lots of different radios on my channel and I get lots in to review and play with and have a look at. So I've probably played with dozens and dozens of radios at this point. And I've had a couple of Patreons over the last couple of weeks also ask me this question. I'm recording this in the middle of January, so it's obviously been a New Year thing. Somebody wants to get a new radio and have a play. Now you'll notice that all of it radios that I'm holding up as examples here are made by Radio Master. And this is kind of my point before we get into the things to think about when you are going to choose a radio. Because if you can answer 5 or 6 basic questions, it will give you a really good idea what radio you should be looking at. The thing is, radios are an incredibly personal thing. Something that I really like, some feature, some layout that really speaks to me as a pilot and is incredibly easy for me to use isn't necessarily going to be the same for you. And I did a whole video, if you remember, talking about best and better and why they are horrific terms to use without qualification. And so many people in the forums use best and better as though it was confetti and just sprinkle it everywhere without explaining what they mean. It's like if somebody came to me and asked me, what car should I buy next? Well, depends what you want. Do you want a 2-seater sports car? A 4-seat saloon? Do you want a truck? Do you want a 7-seater people mover? Do you want it diesel, petrol, electric? What features are important to you? It's exactly the same with the radio. So I've put this video together so I can refer those people who do ask me this question so you can have a look. So let's get into the first stuff, which is a little bit more about have a think about the manufacturer that you are looking at the radio for. So this, for example, the reason I've been holding up all the Radio Master stuff is that I really like them. Why do I really like them? Well, although they introduce and have lots of different models, as a vendor, they don't tend to rev those models and have lots of different versions all coming out all the time. Some manufacturers will release a version of something, and if it's got a few, let's call them features and be kind, bugs if we're not, then what they'll do is they'll release kind of another version that has a slightly improved setup. And that means that those people who bought the original radio are disadvantaged. It also means that it starts to get a bit trickier for things like circuit boards and replacement parts if things are constantly being revved and updated all the time. To me, it means that they probably didn't do their homework before they released the first version of that radio. Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with bringing out additional versions of stuff, but if it's being revved every 3 or 4 months and there are different things, then can you guarantee that that's going to be around in 5 years' time? And that's my big thing with this. A radio is an investment in the hobby. You don't just have to have one, you can have several. You could have a big radio with all the bells and whistles and switches that you could shake a stick at, and you could have a little radio that you just keep around that goes in your backpack that's there for when you want to do either play with the simulator on your computer, or you want something that's little and compact that means that you can go to the field with it in a backpack and not get caught out. The other reason why I personally like Radio Master, and again, there are different opinions on this, and everyone is entitled to their own opinion. But for me, I like the way that Radio Master works, and that's only because they are so integrated into the modern hobby. And what I mean by that is they actively work with the Betaflight developers, with the iNav developers, with the people who write EdgeTX, which is the operating system that runs on this. They kind of work and play with people like Walksnail and third parties, so it makes for easier interoperability. The thing about the modern hobby is that lots of this stuff is open source, and to make it work together, it has to kind of go together like putting your hand inside a glove. Unfortunately, if the testing hasn't been done before a product is released, then the onus is on you as an owner to kind of figure all that stuff out and probably watch half a dozen YouTube videos until you stumble across the answer where someone shows you how to do something. So for me, picking a vendor that has that longevity and investment in the product also has spares availability. If you do break something like a switch, these things do get dropped. It happens to all of us. It happened to me about 4 months ago with an old radio that I have here. And I was very sad, but that switch could still be purchased and replaced. That was actually a FreeSky unit. In that case, it was an old QX7. But making sure that spares availability is still around means that you can maintain that radio, because I've got radios here that I've been flying for 10 plus years, still love, still use, and have had quite a few repairs and updates in that time. So the first thing to think about then is, how many switches do you need? Now, this is a really tricky answer for some people, because if you are new to the hobby, you might not know how many switches that you need, and it might be tempting to just go for the radio with the most switches and sliders and controls, because then you guarantee that you're never going to run out of stuff. However, lots of the really small radios only have a handful of controls. They have a couple of push button or latching switches and maybe 1 or 2 3-position switches. So things like this Radio Master Pocket, for example, is absolutely aimed at the multi-rotor market, because most multi-rotor pilots with a very basic setup will only use 2 switches. One will be used for arming, the other one will be used for the 3 modes. That's probably going to be maybe Horizon, Rate, and maybe the last one is GPS Rescue, or whatever they've got it set up as. However, it's very easy when you're flying UAVs, multi-rotors with a lot more functionality inside, that you might want other switches too. So you might want a pre-arm switch. You might want one for a buzzer, so you can find the thing if it goes down in grass and you can't see it anymore. You might want things for camera controls, turning on and off LED strips. So you can very, very quickly get an idea of how many switches and controls that you need by just watching some videos and setup stuff, and then making sure whichever radio you go for has enough controls. When you get into fixed wing, things can get a lot more complicated. If you're flying without a flight controller where it's up to you to do everything, then you might have a switch for throttle cut so that you can't accidentally start the motor. You might have switches for things like flaps and other controls. You might have dual rates set up for different things as well. So you can have lots and lots of switches. And then if you're using something like ArduPlane or iNav on a fixed wing, then you can easily get 6 or 7 switches without breaking into a sweat. I do here. For example, I have an arming switch, I have a 3-mode switch, I have a mode for return to home, I also then have a switch for beeper, I have a switch for auto trim, and I have a switch for auto tune as well. Those 2 tend to only be used just for the setup phase, but potentially if I change things, I might go through a retrim if I find it's gaining or losing height and hasn't found that neutral position that it needs to. So it's very easy to get into lots of things, and lots of modern radios have these 6 buttons at the top, which can be useful, but in my experience, there's nothing to replace a physical switch that's actually on a radio, because it's easy to both feel where that switch is with your fingertip if you're using FPV, or actually watching the model in the air rather than looking at the radio. I like physical switches. These kind of 6-position things are nice to have, but in my experience are only useful as kind of a secondary control, maybe to turn on and off something like an LED strip. Next thing to think about and answer is, are you a thumber or are you a pincher? So do you kind of just move the controls by holding your thumbs on the ends of the sticks? Lots of gamers do. That's the way I do it, because that's how I PlayStation and Xbox and everything else. If you are like that, then it's usually less vital that there's very little room between the edge of the gimbal and the edge of the radio. With something like this is the Zorro. It's great because if you want to do pinching, it actually works really nicely. It's very ergonomic for that. So you need to make sure that if you're going to look at reviews online, that those people are also showing what the comfort factor is, not only for thumbing, but also pinching too. Some radios have quite a bit of distance and are better than others. So this GX12, one of the latest radios from Radio Master, absolutely can be done because of the smaller gimbals, and smaller gimbals tend to be out near the sides, but radios that have a very, very thin bit between the edge of the gimbal and the edge of the radio are usually better if you are struggling to get the full reach if you're a pincher. Next question then is the size and weight important to you? Something like a smaller radio like this can be really, really handy. Although, to be honest, some of the modern radios that are coming out physically aren't overall that different. By the time you put them in a case, there's not a lot of difference between something like the Zorro and the GX12. And the GX12 is absolutely bristling with lots of additional switches and controls than something like the Zorro. However, these smaller radios are really, really handy if you have those kind of smaller hands, and if you are maybe teaching a child to fly, radio control. These smaller ones don't feel as overwhelming when you start out, and they can be much easier to get into a backpack if you want to go uphill and down dale to go and fly. Obviously, the bigger radios that have the maximum number of switches, at the moment with Radio Master, the TX16S is probably the one that you would go for if you wanted the maximum amount of switches and things. And this is absolutely bristling with switches and sliders and additional trims and everything else. But if you're not going to use them, then you've got to lug that weight around, and you're paying for lots of extra things that you're probably never ever going to set up and use. Next question I'd ask yourself is, how are you going to fly? Are you going to fly FPV? Or are you going to be flying with goggles, line of sight, or a bit of both? The reason that I think that's an important thing to establish for your radio, because you think, well, it doesn't really affect the radio, right? Because that depends whether I'm looking at the model in the air or I'm looking through a camera mounted somewhere on its nose. Well, it kind of does, because actually there is absolutely no point, in my humble experience, getting a radio with a nice big colour touch-sensitive screen like the TX16S if you're never ever going to look at it apart from when you set your radio up. I fly an awful lot of FPV here. I love FPV. It's my favourite way to fly, particularly in fixed wings. So a radio like this GX12 is brilliant because the screen on here is big enough to do all the setup easily. It's nice, clear and easy to read, even in sunshine. We've tested that here. And it also runs the Lua scripts that you need and gets me the information and telemetry that I need to see. All I use it for at the field is two things. One, to select the model memory for the model that I'm about to fly. And second, with something like iNav, I have the iNav Lua script running on it, so it will actually tell me when my satellites have a lock. I can then plug my warp snail unit in, because I don't plug them in until it's got a satellite lock so it doesn't overheat, and then throw the thing in the air and start flying around. When I'm flying, my goggles are on. I am not looking at the radio, which is why having those physical switches are really important, so I can feel my fingertips. Having a nice loud speaker on this is important, so the radio announces to me the battery status. And the last thing I see before I pull my goggles down and throw the plane is usually like the Lua script on here telling me that the model is ready to fly. Penultimate thing to think about here is the receivers that you are going to connect to. The modern hobby has pretty much completely turned into an Express LRS setup now. So if you are buying bind and flies, most of them in the old days, you could kind of choose between Free Sky and Crossfire and Fly Sky and other things as well. These days, you're hard pressed to find anything that isn't Express LRS and maybe one other choice. Some of the longer range stuff still comes with Crossfire because it's great at that. However, almost all radios these days will have some form of bay at the back, which allows you to plug in a module. So this is one of the Ranger micros. This is one of the Express LRS modules. This is the larger version. So if you have a radio that doesn't have Express LRS in it, but is powered by Open or STX, you can just snap that in the back. However, lots of people who are coming into the idea of getting a new radio already have an investment in receivers that are kicking around. You might have had a Fly Sky radio or a Spectrum radio or a Free Sky radio before, and you are buying something like an HTX powered radio, something like this TX16S or one of the others we're talking about today. In those cases, having something called a multi-protocol module will allow this radio to still bind and talk to the vast majority of those receivers too. So you can have the best of both worlds. And that is what this radio is for me. The internal RF system in here is actually a multi-protocol module, so it'll bind to my old Free Sky receivers, it'll bind to Spectrum stuff, it'll bind to Futaba stuff, and that's what I use this for when I'm playing around with things like the bind and fly helicopters for review. When I need Express LRS on this radio, then I just switch the module at the back and I have the best of both worlds. The tip with this is that if I was buying this now, I would have the Express LRS stuff inside the radio, and I'd actually add the NPM on the back, the multi-protocol module piece, as a module. Why would I do it that way round? Well, I would recommend having the one that's going to be the future internally in the radio rather than externally. And the reason for that was really kind of demonstrated in a flying day from the week that I've just had. My flying buddy came to the field, his plane's running Express LRS, he turned on his Zorro, it wouldn't bind, and then he realized he hadn't plugged in the Express LRS module at the back because his Zorro is a multi-protocol version, a 5-in-1 version, I think. So that's a great little reminder that I would always recommend the stuff that's for the future I would have inside the radio. So if you get to a point where you've swapped your old models over and it's all on Express LRS, then you don't have to worry about popping the module in the back or keeping it in the bag. Although, let's be honest, most of us will. The last tip is probably one of the most important ones. If you have the opportunity to get your hands on a radio to try it out, there is no substitute. That same flying day today, I was actually flying this with that 7-inch quad that I built. I'll put a link down below to that series. Express LRS. So I was using the inbuilt antennas with this thing. So he hadn't seen this radio in real life, and it's still, as I'm recording this video, quite new. So he had a chance to put it in his hands, try it out, see what the gimbals felt like, see how it fitted, see how comfortable it was, see whether the switches kind of reached his fingertips. And he was quite impressed with the GX12. I think most of us who've had one have been impressed. But his reaction was really interesting. His reaction was more along the lines of, wow, the videos that I've seen on this haven't done it justice. This feels much nicer in real life. And sometimes things that look really good in a video, actually when you get your hands on them, will feel a bit plasticky and a bit cheap. It depends on the finish and the expense of the plastics that are involved in the manufacture. Sometimes they're better. And by getting your hands on one, it can make a big difference. So if you have an opportunity to actually try some radios out before you go and invest in one, sadly, there aren't a lot of radio control shops now that are kind of around that allow you to do this. My local one, Steve Webb's here, has unfortunately closed, so I'm a bit sad about that. But if you have a flying buddy or somebody else that you can try radios out for, then, it's worthwhile doing it, because then you'll have a rough idea of what feels good in your hands. So hopefully that's been more useful and give you things to think about. I would answer each of these questions by the side. If you've got those answers, then you can actually go and look at the radios that are available and make a more informed decision. Trying to do it and just guess can work, but if you have the answers to this, you're much more likely to choose a radio system from a radio manufacturer with the features that you want that are going to support you now and for the foreseeable future, because if you choose the right radio, it can be a companion for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more years. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Painless 360 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.